stage.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone. Thanks for bearing with me. I'm sure you're starving right now. I'll keep it quick. Let me get my computer open. I just wanted to let you all know I'm highly conversational, and presentation mode is not really my thing. I'm much more of a teacher. So if you ever have any questions throughout, don't wait for me to ask. Just raise your hand, and I'm happy to interrupt myself and answer your question. So you can leave it till the end or midway if you prefer. But to start, my name is Rachael Nemeth. I am the CEO and co-founder of a company called Opus, or Opus Training, known to some people. Today we're going to talk about access, or accessibility. But before we dig into this topic, which is a passion of mine, it's a focus of ours at Opus, and it's a big thesis that we're trying to prove out over the next however long it takes, I want to start with a little bit of history and context. This is my grandfather's restaurant. This is Don's World of Beef. Don's was based in Kansas City in the late 60s. They served up dishes like the beefy with Don's special relish, which really just came out of a can. In its heyday, they had 13 units. They were one of the first QSR chains ever. And Don's apparently gave Arby's a run for their money, though I maintain that's probably family lore, because Arby's won. But my mom worked in all of his restaurants. My dad was a teacher and worked at Steak and Ale by night. And so my world was growing up in restaurants, mostly the analog kind. This is me. I spent 14 years in the restaurant industry, most recently at Union Square Hospitality Group. That is bolt cutters that I misjudged the size of. I will always be remembered for that at USHG. And Opus is actually my second company. My first company I started 10 years ago. It was called ESL Works. And what we did is we built technology that delivered English language training to employee cell phones. 3 years ago, March 2020, I founded Opus. We're on a mission to build the most accessible training platform on the planet. So today, what I want to talk about is a few things. One is why accessibility matters and how we define it. I also want to talk about the three barriers, or the three common barriers to training and how to overcome them. And we'll talk a little bit about cost, because I think accessibility often gets associated with being expensive, or making things more accessible feels expensive, but there's actually ways to do it that are low or no cost and don't require any tech at all. And lastly, I'll share some use cases with some customers that we've had and things that they've done to make their training more accessible. Welcome, everyone. But let's start here. Do me a favor. Look at this blank-ass screen and take a minute to imagine the last in-person training that you had at your restaurant, whether you led it or not, or attended it, whatever it may be. Think about what you taught. Think about who the learners were. And what was the outcome you were looking for? What did you want people to learn? Whether that was anti-harassment training, or new hire training, or training on your latest LTO, what we tend to think about in training is who shows up. And it's really easy to forget who doesn't. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's start with some stats. I'm going to quiz you all, so just shout out the answer. What percentage of restaurant employees were born outside of the US? Any guesses?
60.
Wow, real high. Pretty good though. Any other guesses?
40.
A little lower.
35.
22%. 22% of restaurant employees were born outside the US, but let's take that further. If you just think about back of house, that number shoots up to 40%. Probably more for some of you. Of all restaurants, 49% of restaurant employees are from minority backgrounds, regardless of language. 22% have less than a high school diploma. 22% are likely reading at a 6th grade level, perhaps lower. 60% are under the age of 35. And that percentage is much higher for counter service jobs. I see a lot of nodding heads. On the opposite side of the spectrum, we have a sizable portion of managers who are over the age of 65, baby boomers. And these last two facts that are about age speak to how restaurants are now employing the widest age range in US history. We talk about this more and more at these conferences when I'm meeting with all of you. Tackling the generation gap is incredibly important, and it's an access problem. And to cap things off, on the average in-person or online training, only 50% of these employees show up. So regardless of what that mix may be at your business, you're only reaching about 50% of your employees who have some sort of access barrier, whatever that may be. I love this slide. This is our restaurant tech landscape. Anyone want to take a guess at what's inside this box here, this green box?
All the people that called me last week.
Probably. We might have been one of them, sorry. This is all customer-facing technology. 78% of these technologies are all customer-facing. Some people call it MarTech, whatever you may think or characterize it as. 12% is tech that's for restaurant employees. Right now, only 12% of our tech landscape is designed for our frontline, the majority of our employees. It's a lot of opportunity right now, but it also explains why there's an access issue. So the origin story of this really comes down to the kind of changing demographics of the restaurant industry and how it's going to evolve over the next several years. I also want to note that this is a problem in every industry, and I think that's really important. It's easy to stay isolated in our own industry, but our employees are working in other industries. They're getting off work and they're going to their construction job, they're going to Walmart down the street, and so this is an access problem across the workforce in the United States. And right now, this tech is really built for your majority, not for everyone. But I want to talk about the business case for a minute before I get into these barriers. I promise I'll be quick, but I think this is a really important concept that we don't really think about a lot. So a lot of you understand why accessibility is important and inclusivity is important. We don't have to go into that. It's important for employee retention, hiring, positioning yourself as an employer of choice, of course. But the problem is that it can actually come across as a nice to have, a vitamin, and not medicine. But here's the business case as to why accessibility or accessible training matters. The speed at which we are getting customer data has increased 100x in the last 3 years. All thanks to that 78% of customer-focused technology. It's great. It's coming at us in lightning speed, and that data is coming in real time, which means that customers expect to see our improvements faster. So, when we think about that 78% of MarTech feeding data to our restaurants, but only 12% of HR tech is pulling through, you're changing your business on a dime in response to customer needs, but it's being blocked by the employee experience. How do we accelerate the pull-through? How do we take that data, Make training accessible to everyone so we can close the loop faster. I've talked to some restaurant owners that took them 4 months when they had a customer complaint to reach everyone to talk about that issue. It's too long. So how do we close the loop faster? Well, accessible training, when you're reaching everyone at the same speed, is going to close the loop a lot faster, and it completes the cycle. So when we're just getting top of funnel and not really leveraging it to reach everyone, then that data is basically useless. So I want to talk about these barriers to access. We're going to talk about language, we're going to talk about education level and style, and then we're going to talk about adaptability. 25%, and this is all from Opus data, by the way, 25% of your employees right now, collectively, are non-English speaking learners. This is all based on Opus data, but it actually interestingly matches what the National Restaurant Association has gathered too. So a lot of our data we're finding is matching a lot of the assumptions that have been made across the industry. % of your managers are selecting a language that is not English to learn in. We make a lot of assumptions that managers want to be learning in English, but we'll talk about that in a little bit about why that assumption should change. And you might be thinking, yeah, it's mostly Spanish. And in terms of languages chosen, yeah, it's usually Spanish. About 75% of languages chosen is Spanish, but 27% of your employees need something else. We've seen 31 different languages represented at Opus. We represent 100 global languages. 31 are always in active use. My point is that individually, each language may not be worth translating, and you probably don't even know who needs that language because we're not really capturing a lot of that data in our HR systems. But collectively, 6 to 7% that we've found at Opus, 6 to 7% of our total workforce could benefit from language translation. That's 1 million people. Language translation that's not Spanish. We're not reaching 1 million people in the restaurant industry right now because we haven't been able to translate into other languages or haven't thought about it maybe. And one thing we scarily tell people, so bear with me, is that truthfully, if you have 100 employees in a restaurant and 75 of them speak English and 24 of them speak Spanish and 1 speaks Mandarin and you're not translating into simplified Chinese, then you're not reaching everyone. So how do we solve this problem? It's a lot of ways to do it. Just for a little bit of background too, outside of restaurants, I also have spent 15 years in second language acquisition. I'm certified as an English as a second language instructor. And so a lot of how we see the world right now is how can we actually make it easy for all of you to be thinking about language better? So to take it a step further, why does all of this matter? Migration patterns are changing. We're seeing it in the news every day, but these are the facts, that it's not going to be Spanish in 30 years. It will be Asian languages that we need to represent in our restaurants. The population in the United States is changing. We've also heard numerous times at Opus that in order for restaurants to break into new markets, they have to open up new languages so that they can train those people. So accessible training is now really a benefit that can attract and increase talent. So I've made my argument, I hope. But how can you fix it? So there's a few tips I want to give to everyone. And by the way, you don't have to use any LMS for any of this. Translation is the obvious answer. And translated training is really critical to reach everyone. But why? So those of you who are training specialists in here probably know this, but in case we haven't thought about this way yet, the way that we learn is more complex than day-to-day communication. So you might be thinking about that employee in the kitchen who's like, well, it's easy for me to talk to the chefs, right, in English. But oftentimes we find that those employees are opting to learn in their native language online or in a classroom. So there's differences in the way we communicate day to day and the way that we prefer to learn, and that's really important for knowledge retention. All right. First, translate beyond Spanish. We talked about that. Think about other languages, but how? This is my favorite tip in all of creation, and I'm going to teach you the best tip in the world. How many of you have used Google Translate? You better all raise your hand. How many of you love Google Translate? So you're the one. Google's pretty great. I'm not going to go into nerdy technology pieces, but I'm going to teach you a tip that will make Google work better for you. Right now, you're using Google Translate the wrong way. So get rid of 2 things the next time that you translate in Google Translate, and your whole world's going to open up. And you're going to get about the same accuracy that you would by hiring a translator. The first, get rid of all of that HR language, please. No more policies. Yes, those should be translated, but those are in passive voice. Employees must wear uniforms. That doesn't translate well into every language because not every language uses conditional tenses. So it's not Google's fault, it's just the way that we speak in English, but we have to adjust that to make that more universal. The second is avoid idioms. We love idioms in restaurants. 86 this, fired up, fire up. So many things to think about. If you just avoid idioms and pay attention to some of that language, I guarantee you your translations, for free, in Google, will get between 95 and 99% accuracy. Third, consider localization. Anyone know what I mean by this?
It's where you adapt the content so it can be used for a specific audience. So if you have Cuban employees, you might consider doing something a little different than if you have Mexican employees.
Correct. Dialects. Spanish is seen as this kind of monolith, but it's actually, there's multiple dialects to consider. And so I would encourage you to be thinking about what's next in Spanish. So we offer 4 different Spanish dialects at Opus. There's a lot more than that, I guarantee you. But it's something to consider, and I know there's a lot of demand for that right now when it comes to Spanish. This is one thing that I think is overlooked a lot, which is defining what your override glossary is. There's actually a lot of pieces of language that should not be translated, and that doesn't mean that you're anglicizing anyone's culture. It actually just means that you're trying to get people to communicate in a common language with your guests. Big Mac, sprinkles, whatever it may be, there's actually a lot of things that should be learned in the language in which your customers are consuming it. So decide what those terms are among your entire team, including your managers, so that they're using it as well. And last, and my favorite, invest in body language training. If all else fails, and if you're like, Rachel, man, I'm not gonna do any of that. I'm tired, I'm too busy. Take 5 minutes, do a Google search, or talk to me, I'm happy to give you some tips, and invest in a little bit of body language training with your team, especially your managers, so that they can recognize signals from other languages and other cultures. Pointing is rude in some cultures. Thumbs up is rude. Not staring at a superior is considered respectful in some cultures. So just inviting that kind of training to your team is going to make an immense difference on the level of communication that's welcomed. Actually, before we get into education, any questions about language? We'll get into buy-in in a minute, because there's another piece to this and around kind of accepting what that means. But the truth is if you're not reaching 100% of your team, then you're never going to achieve the outcomes that you're looking for, because there's always going to be a percentage of your employee population that's sitting outside the room. And listen, like, not everybody's ready for this. It takes a different kind of cultural mindset to say, you know what, it actually does matter that 7% of employees are receiving that training in their preferred language. So it does take some time, but a lot of it just comes down to the reality of how, and the argument that we make is like, your workforce is changing, and it's going to be hard to attract talent over the next couple of years if we're not inviting folks who don't speak English. Okay, this one's a little self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go into it, but I like to remind people of it. The next barrier to access is education level and learning preferences. Remember, there's 22% of your employees who have less than a high school diploma. I want to note that that is 2.5 times higher in restaurants. So your employees may have lower reading comprehension levels, a negative attitude about school or learning, bad experiences, or different learning abilities. Plus, layer on the nerdy stuff, like learning modalities. Blah, right? We hear about this all the time, but it's so important. Being able to address the way that people prefer to learn is incredibly important. If we're just sending packets to people, right? Or if we're just having people learn in a kitchen but not kind of combining all of those modalities, we're actually leaving people out. So it does take a combination of all of these approaches to make sure that we're reaching everyone. And I like to make sure that we're kind of emphasizing that because it does make a difference on accessibility. It's an important reminder. Okay, so here's the fun stuff. Some things to consider. Now this slide, specifically when we're thinking about educational tools, doesn't always apply to digital learning, but I like to give people tips when you're thinking about potentially switching to a digital platform or you have one and you're kind of like, well, how can I use it differently or better? In order to encourage people who may have a lower educational level or different learning preferences, there's a few things to look out for in the tech that you're choosing and using and the training that you're choosing and using. One, microlearning. You hear it all the time, but it's important. Attention spans are shrinking, and so the way that we consume information has to change. Two, look for training technology that uses different forms of media. You'll see terms like media rich. It's a good sign. Three, choose a digital platform or any kind of learning approach that allows people to learn at their own speed. I was a slow learner in school. I actually got pretty decent grades, but it just took me a minute to read. I've never been a fast reader. And so if a teacher timed me and said, you have to finish this chapter in 30 minutes, I panicked. So not inviting a self-paced learning environment can lead to panic, performance issues, increased anxiety in the workplace, and your business can suffer as a result. We've seen that when employers are investing in self-paced learning habits of any kind, I promise, it actually lowers your training labor costs. Now, it seems counterintuitive, but when you're allowing people some time to digest, there's less of a need to reteach, which is the most costly. For native mobile features, I won't get super nerdy, but there's a lot of really cool stuff on phones already. So even if you don't want to use a training platform, phones can support things like text-to-speech, not speech-to-text, I don't know what that is, interactivity, lots of really amazing things that phones can do. And this, I think, is the most important. So we hear a lot of buzzwords lately. One of them is the G word, gamification. How many of you have heard that word in the last 48 hours? Yeah, totally. It's everywhere. It's really building a lot lately, but I would encourage, and listen, I don't hate gamification. There's lots of things that are beneficial about it, but I would encourage you when you're thinking and strategizing about learning to not just check that box and say, okay, we need gamification. What you actually need is a safe culture of learning. Gamification is inaccessible to some people. Who here is really highly competitive? Played sports, challenges their friends on crossword, Wordle, Who didn't raise their hand just now? Yeah, that's your employees too. There's a lot of employees who don't like competition, that aren't participating in games. It's not for them. Again, it gives performance anxiety. And so I encourage you to refocus on a bigger goal when you're thinking about how to make your training accessible, which is, what can I do to create a safer culture of learning where everyone feels comfortable learning at their own pace, but also in their own style? So the last piece, you were mentioning, the gentleman over there was mentioning this before about buy-in. We get asked a lot about, how do I convince my employees that this is good, that training is good? You're going to see some resistance, to be blunt. Adaptability is usually referring to older generations or legacy employees. There's a lot of resistance to training. I see a lot of nodding heads. Yes, the root cause is buy-in. It is not age. And there's a few reasons for that. One is low tech abilities causes a lot of discomfort. Two, just a general risk averseness or resistance to change. And three, employees tend to be heavily influenced by their peers. They hear that Joe Schmo doesn't like it, they don't like it. So how do we combat this? There's a few things to think about. One is blended learning styles. What's blended learning? Yeah. It doesn't have to be, again, it doesn't have to be an LMS. It doesn't have to be a training platform. It can be, hey, I'm going to teach you in person. Go and watch this YouTube video when you have some time to reinforce. Or, hey, there's a great documentary on Netflix. Go watch it when you get home. So combining these modalities can actually bring some more buy-in into your organization. Two, establish your advocates. We have a company we work with that had a lot of tenured employees who had made falafel for the last 10 years. And were pretty resistant to some new techniques. Okay, yeah, I don't need training, I can do that, we've all heard it. So instead of fighting it, they actually use them as advocates to deliver the training. Save the training manager some time, we could all use that. But also using your legacy employees as buy-in, as your leading advocates can make a difference. And last is offering different forms of motivation, whether that's certificates or an award ceremony of some kind. These can be free. You don't have to pay for a lot. Sometimes people just really want a high five or recognition in the employee newsletter, and that can make a big difference. So if you're thinking about, oh, I have to do something really high cost, you could, absolutely. You can offer bonuses. I've seen people offer a 5-cent raise, 10 cents, $1. But there's also small ways to just publicly recognize people that make a difference. So I want to show you a few ways that these have been applied in a digital environment to ensure that 100% of employees are reached. I'm also going to see if my microphone will turn on. Microphone to microphone. I'm going to hold my phone to my thing. Okay. So this is Salt and Straw. Salt and Straw, let me go back. 30 units and growing, multiple states. Most of their, they have 2,000 employees. Most of them are Gen Z part-timers. I say most. They also have a percentage of employees that are non-English speaking, and they also have a percentage of employees that are over the age of 35. So they didn't just think about Gen Z, they thought about the entire employee population. Oh, wrong way. This way. Okay. So to start, they chose to offer training no matter what in 100 languages to their team. They opted into that. So this is in simplified Chinese. The user selects this preferred language. They can switch back to English whenever they want. Also, they added the option of listen mode, which means you're going to hear a robot.
Ice cream. To convince Kim he was the right man for the job, Tyler went out to secondhand stores and found several small at-home.
That's just a welcome course. Listen mode works in 100 languages as well. Don't make assumptions that people are comfortable reading. Listen mode can make a big difference. 2, they decided to invest in micro-training tactics and techniques. So they committed to building courses that took about 5 minutes to complete. No matter what their urge was to do a 30-minute video, they didn't do it, or they did it and they broke it up. I see Christine here from Shipley Donuts. They did the same thing. Lots of quizzing to encourage making mistakes and creating that safe culture. And they actually didn't put an accuracy requirement on any of their training. It's a tough decision. I see a lot of 100% requirements. I see a lot of people saying, Rachel, forget it, I need 100%. Well, the process of learning is about making mistakes. So does 100% really matter? What really matters is this last piece. They were encouraging a blended learning environment. They said, you know what? We're not going to make 100% of our training digital. It's the wrong way to do it. So instead, they forced employees back to work to talk to a team lead who would coach them and give them feedback. So it actually didn't matter what the quizzing score was. What really mattered is that they were connecting with the team lead, and the team lead, the legacy employee, was saying, great job, or try again. To give you some context here, Salt and Straw changes their flavors every single month, and every employee is expected to talk to guests about the ice cream as if it were a fine wine. It's wild. And it's delicious, too. So this isn't just knowing the new chocolate chip flavor. It's also about ensuring that employees are comfortable using that kind of language. So when you bring all of this together, these small steps, choosing to offer the training in that language, making sure that there's some sort of micro-training component, and bringing it back to the in-person component, they're seeing 80% daily engagement, and they saw over 90% adoption within 4 weeks. This does not have to be applied to a digital platform. Like I said, a lot of this access is just about thinking a little differently about safe environments. So one thing to think about as we wrap up is, one, I'm around for the next couple of days. If you want to nerd out about access, please come and find me. I would be happy to chat. I'd love to hear what you're doing, how you're seeing the world, anything you disagree with, anything you like. If you want to download the conference app, you can actually see some examples of different kinds of accessible training. It's free, and there's also cool stuff in the conference app that Isabel made around the speakers. And feel free to stay in touch. And thank you very much for listening.